Welcome to the second episode of IndyCar Hot Takes, your hot takes, my opinions on them. The first hot take comes from Matthew Cox, who says, hot take, delayed yellows are the worst part of IndyCar. And it's kind of ironic that this comment was written before the Portland race, where we saw this rear its ugly head once again, where Agustin Canapino spun out, stalled the car, but because there was a pit sequence going on, the full course yellow was not brought out until Felix Rosenqvist, who was the last driver and team to not pit, was able to make a pit stop. And while I won't say it's the worst aspect of IndyCar right now, I would rank a few more things a little bit higher than that, namely the red flagging at the end of the race. But it's definitely controversial, and I think the biggest issue that I have with it is that while, yes, you're trying to keep things fair, and understandably, if you kept the pits open but brought out a full course yellow, unless you did a virtual safety car sort of thing where the field by rule is neutralized to a certain speed, even if you brought out a full course yellow, there would be drivers going full speed trying to get back to the pits before the pace car packs the field up. Understandable that they're trying to mitigate that as best as possible. But I think that at some point, there's going to be a real nasty accident where you're going to have a car sitting stationary and another car will have a similar or a different kind of an off, and that car will find the stationary car, and that's how you get somebody hurt. So yeah, and definitely from a legitimacy standpoint, I mean, obviously, anything that smells or doesn't pass the smell test in terms of what, is giving us the absolute most legitimate contest possible, sure. Yeah, I completely agree. So yeah, the delayed yellows, they're tough. I mean, frankly, I would just want to see IndyCar go to the World Endurance Championship rules, where unless it's absolutely necessary, just bring out a virtual safety car and have everybody drive around at 60 miles an hour. But I think that in an environment where, having 3 red flags in the Indy 500 is universally cheered by everyone in the stands, probably not going to fly. I'm a Ghost says, hot take, even without the kart IRL split, NASCAR would have ended up becoming the most popular by the early 2000s at the latest. Well, here's the thing. That's not really a hot take, because NASCAR was already more popular than IndyCar before the split. I've got a bunch of old magazines, yearbooks, like the Indy 500, Carl Hugness yearbook, and books from the time, or even retrospectives from the time, that even with a merged, kart controls the overall championship and USAC controls the Indianapolis 500, there was still so much lamenting and bellyaching, and it's all unnecessary, by the way. I'm not defending this, but there was so much bitching about the lack of American drivers, which was always a crock of crap. There was always the lamenting and bitching about not enough ovals, when kart in 95 had way more ovals than we currently have, and more ovals were being built to be added to the schedule in future years. That was always a crock of crap. But something that was legitimate was that, they would talk about how Jeff Gordon and Dale Earnhardt would sell more merchandise and would be more recognizable to, the public at large than a Jacques Villeneuve or a Robbie Gordon. Like, understandable. But that was always going to happen with NASCAR. Like, you regardless of what IndyCar did, the 2001 Daytona 500 was probably always going to happen. And that, while it was a tragedy, was the thing that absolutely spurred NASCAR into, turbocharged their mainstream relevancy. And they had already been building it up so well through the 90s with the Brickyard 400 and the 50th anniversary celebration in 1998. Like, NASCAR was always going to be the 500-pound gorilla in the room. The issue was that IndyCar racing was so busy destroying itself, they couldn't ride the wave of NASCAR popularity in the ways that would have benefited them. Because if you look at IndyCar racing, up until about 2001, there were still massive sponsors, massive investments from manufacturers, tire companies, the works. Every company pretty much that was involved in NASCAR was also involved in IndyCar in a major way. The sad fact of the matter is the ROI did not match what was being spent in IndyCar racing, and it did match what was being spent in NASCAR racing, at least for a time. So while that's not a hot take, I think you're absolutely right that NASCAR was always going to overtake IndyCar. That was inevitable. But to the level that it has gotten, that was completely avoidable. Henry Shelley says, hot take, an underrated aspect of F1's rise is also the amount of attention that they pay to their feeder series. Fans know of guys like Kimi Antonelli and Theo Pouchary. Meanwhile, you ask Miles Rowe or who Michael D'Orlando is, people just don't know. Broadcast the Road to Indy on Peacock, or at least get actual moving cameras and keep it on YouTube like GT World Challenge does. I think a big issue with surrounding the whole Road to Indy ladder right now, there's two major issues why people don't know who these guys are or, where they are coming up until they pretty much are getting to IndyCar. Number one is that there's beef between Dan Anderson, who controls the bottom two rungs, USF 2000 and Indy Pro 2000, and Roger Penske, who controls Indy Next and IndyCar. The ladder is broken right now. They get along, but it's like a couple that's in separation. I wouldn't say that it's super functional right now. And so even in the extreme example, which is Miles Rowe, you have actually seen some promotion around him. But that was only when it was guaranteed that he would be going to Indy Next, which is controlled by Penske Entertainment. Despite the fact that he is a young black driver who is so... because I've had some great conversations with him. I think the world of Miles. I think he is the real deal, and so few people know that. It's very disappointing. Hopefully that will change now that he's totally under the Penske Entertainment banner going forward with Indy Next and IndyCar. Presumably he'll get there. But, it's such a shame that I agree with you that you can't see these drivers come up in a really proper fashion. And when you look at something like Kart Chaser, the fact that they have a full broadcast crew, pit reporters, moving cameras, all that stuff, how Road to Indy can't do that is shocking to me. And then once you get to the Indy Next level, yes, they have a full proper broadcast, but it's locked away on Peacock. And I bet, I want to be very clear that I do not have any access to the numbers of the Indy Next broadcasts on Peacock, but I bet it's... I can't imagine it's very high, the amount of people that watch those broadcasts. And that being said, with F1, not only do they promote their feeder series, but you can also access the races through like Watch ESPN, which is available to anyone who has access to the ESPN channel. So while it's not as, it's not easy to watch F3 or F2 races or F4 races, I would say it's probably easier than trying to watch an Indy Next race on Peacock. Michael D'Orlando did come up in the previous question, so let's introduce Michael D'Orlando, who actually has a hot take as an Indy Pro 2000 driver. He says 100 Days to Indy needs to cover the entire season. Well, first of all, I just sung the praises of Miles Rowe, and it's interesting that Henry would also bring up Michael D'Orlando, who is another great driver who's coming up through the ranks of the Road to Indy, and I have a suspicion he'll also be a great IndyCar driver someday. Shout out to Simon Sykes as well, who won the USF 2000 championship. A lot of talent in the IndyCar pipeline right now. It'd be great if we could get a little bit more spotlight on them. But I think the big thing with 100 Days to Indy, I appreciated the effort. I think I should say that first. The effort that went into getting a TV show put together, it's appreciated. But I definitely think that it missed the mark to a certain extent. I mean, the TV numbers, particularly in the key demographics that you would want something that is an answer to Drive to Survive, meaning the below 35 demographics, I think were pretty disappointing. And the TV ratings themselves, I mean, we're not talking like 1 million people were watching these shows. So I think that Michael's right. If they did have a more consistent schedule, if it wasn't a limited TV show, if it was something maybe a little bit more consistent, maybe it would gain a viewership and popularity. But I just think that 100 Days to Indy, I just don't know if it would really do what it needs to do, even if it was given a full season. I think the platform just needs to be different. I think that, again, appreciate the effort of the CW. I appreciate that they picked up that show, and maybe things will be a little bit better from a motorsport fan perspective now that Xfinity's going there. So in the future, this could change and it could get better. But I mean, I think honestly, 100 Days to Indy, if they'd released it on like YouTube, it would have probably had a bigger impact. Or if you put it on TikTok somehow. I don't know if you could put a 30-minute video on TikTok, but I think there were avenues that could have been distributed in a different way, that it would have been seen by more of the right people. And if they want to give it a second shot, I think they need to look at avenues that are not traditional. Noah Roth says, hot take, IndyCar, Super Formula, and Formula 2 could all use variants of the same car and chassis to cut costs and create interoperability between the series. Basically, create a universal car and have the 3 series use it with maybe different bodywork. I'm not going to elaborate on this yet, but Noah, I've had the exact same thought. I've thought a lot of things through about this, and Professor Know-It-All is going to have a video at some point explaining exactly what he would do in just a situation. Dank Rolowski, I think that's right. I'm going to screw up a name once a video, I think. But he says, how could you think it's debatable whether Bourdais is a top 10 IndyCar driver of all time? Even with his F1 stint, he's top 10 in wins, titles, etc. I think the debate of Sebastien Bourdais being a top 10 driver of all time is not the fact that he has the stats, but you have to understand that most of his stats, the things that put him where he is on, in the echelon of race car drivers in IndyCar, happened in the split era. And you have to take that into account. Was Champ Car totally, was it just like, was Sebastien Bourdais the only competitive driver and team in Champ Car at the time? No, there were great drivers. AJ Allmendinger, Justin Wilson, Paul Tracy. There were a whole bunch of drivers that were competitive enough to challenge Sebastien Bourdais. The thing is that any driver who had success during the split era is always going to have an asterisk next to their stats. And Sebastien Bourdais clearly proved that he belonged in IndyCar in a merged series and could compete with literally anybody. I don't think anyone is denying that. I think the question is, would he have had the same level of success if he had competed in a merged series, or even a series that had the equivalent talent of a merged series? Because I would look at something like Alex Zanardi's dominant run in the late 90s. I mean, like kart, who was missing from kart at that time? Who can we point to that wasn't in kart, that was in the IRL, that would have significantly changed the competitive nature of that year of the kart series? But in Champ Car, you can say, well, Penske wasn't there, Ganassi wasn't there, Andretti wasn't there. And so if Penske, Ganassi, and Andretti were there in Champ Car, along with Forsyth, along with Rousport, along with Walker Racing, and some of the big teams there, would Sebastien Bourdais have racked up as many wins and as many championships as he would have under the circumstances in which he won those championships? That's the question, and that's the debate. It's not a debate of whether or not Sebastien Bourdais is good enough to be a top 10 driver ever all time in IndyCar racing. I think that's a much more reasonable debate than saying, well, he's got all these raw stats, but the raw stats don't tell the full story because of the state that IndyCar racing was in at the time. AXC, that's the best way I can pronounce that, says, hot take, the restart with one lap left in the Indy 500 was a disgrace for the sport and was something that should never happen. And before I address this, I also want to talk about Gage McPherson's response to this because it's worth talking about. And he said there was a one-lap shootout in 1996 and 1997. So, and that's true. That is absolutely factual evidence. But I would say this, once again, because it seems like we're just talking about the split in this video, and that's fine. But of the Indy 500s that you would look at and say, I want to emulate that. I want my Indy 500 this year to be like that. 96 and 97 are probably two of the greatest examples of Indy 500s that you don't want to emulate. You don't want to have people thinking, yeah, that Indy 500 reminded me of 1997. Right. So while it's not totally unprecedented that the Indy 500 ended in a one-lap shootout, the 97 500 was a complete joke that they restarted that race, very similarly to how they did it in 2023. 1996 was fairly legitimate. They cleaned up the track and they said, well, you know, we want to end the race under green, so they threw the green flag. All the competitors knew the green flag was coming out. It was stated in the rule book of how that restart procedure would work, and they got it done. The 2023 500 was a disaster, in my opinion, in terms of officiating in a lot of different reasons. I mean, number one was the fact that there were 3 red flags at the end of it to begin with, and I think the drivers, particularly Alexander Rossi, pointed out on his podcast that that should never happen, where you roll out of the pits and on the outlap out of the pits, you should take the green flag. That should never happen again, because that was definitely a safety issue, and I'm glad they got away with it. I'm glad they got an exciting finish for the fans, but I think they really, really need to take a hard look at that, because that was a legitimacy question and a safety question, and those are the two things that IndyCar racing needs to work on and needs to make sure that it's safe and it's legitimate. Autonomic Mechanism says, until we get some sort of chassis differentiation, multiple chassis or multiple aero, and we get 950 horsepower, things are always going to seem like we are still behind from the glory days of kart. I don't accept that it's a cost thing. The teams spend more money on damper programs than they did manufacture aero kits. Fans don't care about dampers. Okay, so there's a lot of things to break down here. Number one, yes, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about it. I've talked about it on this channel for years. Yes, there is stagnation in IndyCar racing. I understand why there is. I think there is a fear, especially, I mean, Roger Penske even admitted it in an interview with Nathan Brown of the Indy Star last fall, where he said something to the effect of, on the subject of a new car, he looked at what NASCAR and the challenges NASCAR was having with their next-gen car, specifically as a reason why IndyCar shouldn't go to a new car. That's disappointing for sure, because at some point, IndyCar racing introduced new cars every single year. Teams bought new cars and developed new cars every single year, and now we're on year number 12 of the current chassis, though obviously, as the series would point out, and rightfully so, the car has developed significantly from where it was in 2012. But I think that looking at kart and looking at IndyCar racing, what it was for the majority of its history up until this point, it was always cutting edge. And right now, IndyCar racing is anything but cutting edge. There's no boundaries necessarily being pushed outside of Indy 500 time trials, where we are beginning to get close to a track record again. But certainly it's been a long, arduous process to have fans be able to see something that they have not seen before. And the wow factor of Gilles de Ferran doing 241 miles an hour at Fontana is now 23 years in the past. The peak technological advancement of IndyCar racing is 2 decades plus behind us now, almost a quarter of a century. That's just the reality of the situation. I do agree that the dampers being the choice of the one open source thing in IndyCar racing was a silly one back in 2012. They could have literally picked anything else, and it probably would have been better from a fan interest perspective. And I also agree with your point that the teams spend a lot of money. Like, the teams, I think I said this in the last video, we're pretending like IndyCar racing is totally a business that doesn't work. It definitely works for a lot of different people, and I think the team owners are one of them. They're paying, I think there are now 5 IndyCar drivers around the $6 million per year mark in salary. That will go into effect starting next year. So teams are able to pay drivers $6 million plus a year. Millions of dollars in driver salaries, millions of dollars in new team facilities, millions of dollars in damper programs. The spending hasn't stopped. The spending hasn't got less. The only thing that has gotten less is the ability for fans to see differentiations in cars and have less of that mechanical interest in racing. And yeah, sure, yes, competition on a mechanical side would raise the cost, but the cost is going to get raised whether we're talking driver salaries, whether we're talking damper programs, whether we're talking hospitality units, whether we're talking new team facilities. Those costs are always going to go up. Racing is always going to cost a lot of money. My opinion is I'd like to see that money spent on the racetrack and not outside of it. Hog Ziegler says, hot take, IndyCar's single TV network contract hinders its growth. More networks that have a vested interest in providing quality coverage makes it better for all, right? The NFL has increased their number of media partners in the last 30 years, and they are better off. So, yeah, I mean, the NFL is a poor comparison because the NFL is literally not only the 900-pound gorilla in the room, they are the gorilla in the room. The NFL, you can't even compare it. I think the thing with IndyCar's TV network contract is I think we all forget how bad things were with IndyCar on ABC. The biggest races were on ABC and the rest of them were on NBC Sports Network. And I would say that was objectively, from a TV standpoint, worse than what we have now. Now, the benefit of having those races on ABC was that there was no streaming platform, and Disney is pretty lackadaisical with their streaming contracts. It's why Formula One signed with them in the first place. And because of that, IndyCar streamed their practices and qualifying on YouTube. And that, I thought, helped grow the sport tremendously. So, unfortunately, while it's better that IndyCar racing is on one TV network, I think the only issue I would have with NBC, there are 2 issues I'd have. The fact that they are so restrictive on streaming, and the fact that NASCAR is also broadcast on NBC. That's a positive and a negative, but I'll focus on the negative here because this is a hot take video. The issue with NASCAR being on NBC is that the minute the Indy 500 ends for IndyCar, NBC becomes a NASCAR network. IndyCar becomes the redheaded stepchild, and it's all NASCAR all the time from the point that the 500 ends. IndyCar gets 3 to 4 months of solid promotion on NBC, but the rest of the year, from a motorsports perspective, it's NASCAR. I think that's a bigger issue than whether or not IndyCar is spread across different networks. And our final hot take of the day is Code Diggler. I think that's how you say it. He says, the broadcasts were better with Paul Tracy. So this is an interesting one, because I don't think James Hinchcliffe and Townsend Bell is a bad booth combination. In fact, I'd kind of like to keep it. But I think there is a place for Paul Tracy on the broadcast, and there's something missing without him. Personally, I think the big thing that NBC is missing right now in terms of their IndyCar broadcasts is a studio segment before the race. I think their pre-races are a bit boring. I think that what you see in virtually every other sport, including NASCAR, including Formula One, are a panel of folks who have experience in the sport or have interesting enough takes to have a discussion and talk about storylines in a water cooler style way. And Paul Tracy, I think, could be like a Shaquille O'Neal on NBA, on TNT. You could have him just be a silly guy who, just shoots from the hip, says whatever he wants, and kind of antagonizes the other panelists on the board in the pre-race. And whether or not he gets things right or says the right things, that's irrelevant. I think that from an entertainment standpoint, you see the NFL do it, you see the NBA do it, you see NASCAR do it with their Peacock Pit Box, you see Formula One. The fact that IndyCar doesn't have like a panelist show outside the Indy 500, and even then it's the Peacock Pit Box with Mike Tirico, who is an objective journalist and just a host. He's not really going to hot take. Danica Patrick, who pays attention to one race a year, and then Dale Earnhardt Jr., while he pays attention, he's a NASCAR guy. So it's hard for him to really opine on IndyCar racing in a way that engages the viewer outside of an outsider NASCAR perspective. So from my perspective, I would love to see an IndyCar-focused panel on the pre-race, hot taking and throwing things out there and getting people amped up and talking about these races. That's the biggest thing right now, is the fact that people, I think once the race ends, outside of very specific and certain circumstances, you forget IndyCar exists because there isn't a larger discussion taking place outside. So, thank you guys for listening to my discussion of your hot takes. Leave yours in the comments for next week's video.